Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar for the Georgetown Global Dialogues. We're going to have two more of these webinars, and we're hoping to explore some of the histories of the subjects that we are going to be discussing in April. And today we have with us three of the guest speakers in DC in April. And we are going to talk about the histories of global coexistence. And it's a subject, obviously, that almost it's hard to overstate its significance at this particular moment. In almost everything we see today, everything we read today, we are reminded of just how fragile the idea of coexistence has become, given our existing political arrangements, our existing economic arrangements. And I think in order to think about the future, how we can actually transcend this clearly intolerable situation, we have to sort of start thinking about what are the models, what are the paradigms actually available to us? Is the past of any help in thinking about what coexistence could be, what it was actually like for a vast majority of the world's population for hundreds of years? Because obviously the political entity that we all inhabit around the world, the nation state, is a very recent construct, recent in the long span of human history. And obviously, its record is so incredibly bad. But obviously, it's also true that we can't find a way out of it. And so I think, start off actually by asking Ranjit, who wrote a wonderful book, Ranjit Hoskote, called Confluences, published a few years ago, published in various languages. But I think in that book, that's the first book I read that actually very rigorously exposed the idea of culture as a construct, culture as something uh, made of um, so many different and diverse elements, to the point where it is impossible for any political organization to monopolize it. They can, of course, make that claim, but that claim is immediately rendered null and void by the sheer existence of diversity. Um, I mean, there's so many aspects of this question that we can explore, and we don't actually have enough time. There'll be also a Q&A at the end of our discussion, where we're going to invite some of the members of the online audience for this to pose questions to us. But I would very much like to start with Ranjit and sort of ask him what he makes of this very broad subject. Ranjit?
Thank you so much, Pankaj. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you and with Etche and Mohsin as we flag off this process of dialogue, which I do hope will have resonances both at the level of discourse and in terms of possibly in a very modest way, beginning to reimagine this very fraught world in which we find ourselves. You cited this book, which in German was called Kampfabsage, and in English was called Confluence, which Ilya Troyanov and I wrote in 2007, actually. It's been a while. But just the other day, we were looking back at it, and we thought, amazingly, that despite our belief in human perfectibility, the problems, the crises that we flagged in that book continue to be not only present, but have, if anything, got worse. And the way it worked out for both of us, our journey to this book, is that both of us come from Ilya in Europe and I in South Asia. We come from diasporic backgrounds with histories of moving from region to region across languages. And so in a deeply intuitive way for both of us, there was a resistance to the idea that the individual can be conscripted into a single unitary nation state with a single language, with a single notion of who can belong on the grounds of religion or ethnicity or whatever it might be. And as I'm speaking, I suddenly realized that Georgetown University was founded in 1789, the same year as the French Revolution. And it strikes me as sad that from that foundational moment of the French Revolution, what we've taken is this deeply, deeply constraining and constricting vision of the nation state as a site of belonging. What we seem not to have taken with us is the notion that we can craft our own lives without reference to dogmas about governance, about political structure, about territoriality. So to me, thinking about global coexistence today means also drawing in a critical and not in a nostalgic way on models that we inherit from the past, and not only from wherever we might belong, but across the range of human experience. So for instance, in Confluence, it was very important for us to look at Al-Andalus, the 7 centuries in which the Iberian Peninsula was shaped in many ways by the dominant presence of Islamic powers, but who produced, together with their Catholic and Jewish neighbors, a culture that was truly, truly pluralist. We are not idealizing this situation. Clearly, there was conflict, there was violence, there were all kinds of asymmetries. But what we should not lose sight of was the way in which culture was produced as a unifying field of belonging through this coming together of Arabic and Latin and Greek and different religions, just learning to form a kind of convivencia. So that was an example for us. How do we reclaim and redeem some of these examples and bring them into the present? So I'm going to put that in play. Admittedly, there are all kinds of details that we need to go into when we situate this historically. But to me, the takeaway is that we need to remember, for instance, that it is out of this larger Mediterranean situation of multilingual, multi-religious plurality that we have the early foundational texts of modern Judaism, and they were written in Arabic. It's something that's very easy to forget today, given the extremely tragic scenario in which we find ourselves in that region.
Well, speaking of Al-Andalus, I mean, I think you've actually chosen for me the next person to speak on this subject, because once that experiment comes to an end or is brutally terminated, a lot of people who are thereby expelled from Spain end up moving to what we now know as Turkey, which then becomes the next great experiment in, I suppose, a mode of coexistence, a mode of political existence that is not oppressive for minorities. Again, I think, as you point out, one can, idealize, or one tends to idealize these situations. Obviously, there's conflict. Obviously, there's violence, often between communities of different backgrounds, different ethnic, racial backgrounds. But that violence is contained violence. It's not the kind of violence that we're accustomed to now in the modern world, in the history of the modern nation state. So, AJ, I'd like to ask you a question about, just what the Ottoman experience, and of course, the violent overturning of that Ottoman experience by the new Turkish nation state, and the sort of attempt to initially suppress some of that experience, and then to sort of start reclaiming it gradually. How do you see that? But before I do that, I'd just like to actually let the online participants know that they can actually already start posing their questions in the chat box, and we can start looking at those questions for the panelists. HS.
To be with you and with Ranjit and Mohsin for this panel. And I was already thinking about Ottoman Empire before the panel, and I was thinking about Andalusia and the texts that Ranjit mentioned before, written in Arabic, both in Palermo and in Granada. But then, talking about Ottoman Empire, trying to remember those days, trying not to idealize while remembering. And to do this today in Berlin is quite ironic, deeply ironic, to be honest. I come from a country where culture of forgetting has pretty much shaped the nation state in Turkey. Turkish state is, it wouldn't be completely wrong to say that Turkish state is founded upon the pillars of forgetting, and first and foremost, forgetting the Armenian genocide, for instance. And that forgetting, which happened in 1915, and the Turkish Republic was founded in 1923, that massive forgetting, that profound forgetting, has as if ingrained the practice of forgetting to the genes of the Turkish nation. But then, now I'm in Berlin, I am in Germany, where culture of remembering, a completely opposite culture, is very much proudly owned and has been practiced since Second World War. However, I think it is mostly misremembering what happened, or remembering in the wrong way, because somehow Turkey coming from the culture of forgetting, Germany coming from the culture of remembering, somehow end up in the same avenue of doing the wrong thing and not drawing lessons from the history. And it's always ironic to remember what Hannah Arendt said, drawing lessons from history is a myth. But I think nation states are constantly misremembering organisms as opposed to individuals, as Ranjit said, who, as a form of resistance, do remember, and they do remember everything. One of the greatest writers in my language, Said Faik, wrote something once, which I made an epigram to my last novel in Turkish, which is another ironic fact. He said, those who remember everything will be left homeless or stateless. I think we are, like, as individuals, taking this risk of being homeless and nationless while trying to remember, or when trying to tell the things that we remember. And we are becoming maybe true cosmopolitans, but we also risk of being completely unhomed. And why do we do this? We try to learn from history, and we try to tell the things that we learn from history, and we want history to inspire us. But then I think it is almost impossible not to misremember when remembering, because Ottoman Empire, as Ranjit mentioned, the violence and the brutality that has been committed in Andalusia, Ottoman Empire was not much different. Of course, there was brutality, there was violence, there was oppression. But then, even today, not only in Turkey, but also in the surrounding region, in Middle East, there's a tendency among people to remember Ottoman Empire as the good times, when there was dignity, when there was pride, and so on. How much of this is rewriting history? How much of this is determined by today's political situation or needs is not clear to me. And I think, looking at the past is pretty much looking through a kaleidoscope. I mean, like a little tiny shift in today's reality can change the picture completely. But then it's always important to think of the past as somewhere that we can take inspiration from. And what I'm most inspired, of course, is the fact that Andalusia region, or the Aegean Sea, around the Aegean Sea, there was this culture around Mediterranean, but particularly around the Aegean Sea. Where I come from, I'm from Izmir. My hometown is on the Aegean coast. And that culture, which at the time, in ancient times, gave way to the this ancient Greek culture and art, I think is something that we can look up to and we can aspire to, where there were smaller city-states and cities were political unions rather than big countries or states. So yeah, when I think of the past and when I dig deeper to see something beautiful that we can take inspiration from, I immediately go to the Aegean coast and the ancient Greek times, I think.
So the past is a kind of living resource here, and it's up to you what you want to take from it, what you find helpful in your particular political or intellectual project. So, obviously selective remembering, selective forgetting, that goes on all the time, and it's better to be aware of those. I mean, I think we are in a situation in India today where I think there are certain aspects of the past that are being vigorously remembered, embellished, distorted, misrepresented, and other parts of the past that are completely suppressed and denied. So we see that, with big political movements, how they play up certain aspects of the past which favors them, such as the violence in the past, such as the sort of sectarian violence in the past, on which they put their own interpretation. But then the longer histories of coexistence are ones that are obscured. As you were speaking, Ajay, it occurred to me that actually, all three of us belong to civilizations with very long pasts, also civilizations that have, in a way, mutated into nation states after a great deal of violence and the kind of violence that goes on to this day. And so this process of selective remembering, selective forgetting is something we've kind of known all our lives at different phases, at different political phases in our respective countries. And that seems to me almost a kind of a better introduction to us than a kind of formulaic introduction that I was supposed to give at the beginning of this talk to all three of us, but rather think of us as representing sort of violated civilizations or forgotten.
When you said, I'm sorry to interrupt, but then I just noticed that Americans maybe are listening to us.
Yes.
Then I thought, how do they hear this? I'm talking about ancient Greek civilization, but then I'm not talking about something that I read in the books. I grew up in very close to Ephesus, theater, for instance, or the big library, ancient Greek library, and so on. So I was running around those places, and those people who lived there, the philosophers, poets, and so on, they were like yesterday. So the sense of history, since you said that we belong to those civilizations, sense of history maybe for us here might be different than those living in United States, for instance. These are not something that we read like fairy tales. This was my daily life when I grew up.
I want to bring in Mohsin into this conversation because, I think, again, this experience of being inheritor to a very complex civilization with many, many different strands, very many different traditions, religions, cultures coming together, and especially your part of Pakistan, Mohsin, which is, sort of almost a kind of major crossroads of world civilization, with so many currents have flown through it. And again, that is a history for us in the subcontinent. That is not a live history anymore. That's not something that's emphasized in our textbooks. And so, what is the project of reclamation there? How does one keep in touch with those kinds of histories and keep them in a way still alive as a resource?
Well, I think it's tricky when you think of Pakistan as something quite distinct from Andalusia or Anatolia or the rest of the Indian subcontinent, South Asian subcontinent. You know, in many ways, the Iberian Peninsula is sort of the center of something, even if it's the end of Europe or the beginning of Africa. Similarly, Anatolia is the center of something, of this sort of Eastern Mediterranean world. And India, of course, bounded by the Himalayas to the north and the ocean to the south, has also thought of itself as the center of something. It's difficult to conceive of Pakistan as the center of something. You know, Pakistan is sort of a hinge. Yes, the Indus Valley civilization was here, whatever, 4,000 years ago, and many of our cities have been here for a long time. But in a sense, in the contest between the Persian Empire, between the Mongols, between the Mughals, between the kings of India, we were sort of, you know, the rimland. Lahore, where I spend most of my time, is the place that you had to conquer to finance the rest of your invasion of India when you came from the west and the north. Or the place you had to convince before you took your ideas up through the Himalayas to China, as Buddhism traveled through here. You know, Alexander made it as far as where I am, and then sort of turned back. So in Pakistan, you see this real attempt to, you know, in a way, what we have been talking about is reappropriating history, forgetting the parts that are not useful, and embellishing the parts that are. But the question is, you know, useful for what? And I think useful for the purpose of allowing the exclusionary aspects of what we consider the modern nation state to come into existence. You know, contemporary Turkey must exclude things to be Turkey and not the Ottoman Empire. India must exclude things to become, you know, the modern India and not what it was. And the question is, you know, what must Pakistan exclude? And I think Pakistan struggles to come up with precisely what can be excluded without, you know, destroying the entire edifice, is illustrative to the challenges that the world faces. Because here in Pakistan, you know, the first step was you exclude the Hindu. And you say, well, you know, we are the homeland for the Muslims. But then you look to your west and you discover that Afghanistan is also full of Muslims. You know, Iran is also full of Muslims. So if we are the homeland of the Muslims, are we, you know, really just kind of permeable to the Iranians and to the, you know, Afghans? And much of Pakistan and Afghanistan's fraught history, where the Afghan governments have over the years refused to recognize the border between the two countries. And Pakistan and Iran only recently exchanged missile fire over their border, suggests that those borders do remain somewhat porous. You know, I was just speaking to somebody the other day who claims that much of the petrol in Lahore is actually trucked in illegally across the Iranian border. And of course, growing up, and we saw the arrival of Kalashnikovs and narcotics in the 1980s across the Afghan border. So we have this very permeable West. And then the question is, okay, well, you know, what do we then exclude? You know, how do we complete the process of exclusion the modern nation state requires? Well, you can say, well, if Iran is a sort of Shia majority country, then perhaps one could try to exclude Shias, except that there's a rather inconveniently large percentage of Pakistan which is Shia. And who knows what it is, and nobody's quite sure. But even if it's 10, 20%, it's still 25, 50 million people. It's a lot of people. So difficult to do, although of course people have tried it. But the nation state hasn't embraced this. It's left to sort of more fervent, you know, believers to go after that kind of thing. But then you're still left with the problem of Afghanistan. Most Afghans are also Sunni, although Afghanistan, like Pakistan, has a Shia minority. And then you sort of stumble upon, well, you know, if you can't exclude them, you know, you might as well own them. And a series of disastrous Pakistani foreign policy interventions in Afghanistan is sort of the result. You know, how do we separate from Afghanistan? Well, if we can't, we should determine what happens there. You know, with terrible results for everybody. Now, I think in this context, when we talk of what our history is, there is, of course, a more inclusive history that, we have built upon the layer upon layer of Hindu and Buddhist and sort of pre-Hindu and Buddhist and Muslim and many other civilizations and languages. And, we are this cosmopolitan polyglot. But again, that doesn't yield a very good history for nation state exclusionary purposes. So Pakistan, I think, watching Pakistan, wriggle a bit like a worm on the hook of the nation state's attractiveness, that thing that it dangles in the water to supposedly hook its citizens and get them to buy in, is maybe illustrative to the problem that almost every country is facing. I think in some ways Pakistan really is at the cutting edge of the crisis of the nation that so many countries are facing, because when you look closely, each of them has a similar incomplete exclusionary historical project, and they're all foundering in their attempt to do something with it.
Ranjit, I mean, that's what Mohsen is saying in a way speaks to those of us who've been observing India's journey in recent years, again, sort of paralleling this futile pursuit of purity or a pure essence of some kind that can be cleansed of all, so-called external influences and sort of achieve this incredibly sort of impossible aim of pure essence or purity, national purity of this kind. And I think that attempt also consumes now increasingly so much of national energy, national time, and we know in advance that it's actually going to fail. I mean, my question to you is, do you think that there are enough resources within existing traditions of coexistence in India? And those exist, no question about it. I mean, I think we should not extrapolate from the experience of North India or from the dominance of a certain kind of Indian sensibility over other Indian sensibilities to conclude that this is now the dominant paradigm and this is going to triumph all over the country, because that's simply not true. There is a resistance to it, and its resistance to it is often in the name of regional identities, regional traditions. Do you think those are alive and sufficiently vigorous enough to prevent India from going further down this particular journey Mohsen has just described?
Oh, well, listening to Mohsen, I just thought to myself, well, this exactly as you said, Pankaj, this is the journey that we avoided for decades. And now it seems to have become the goal of our political system to establish not just a powerful nation state, but an ethno-nationalist nation state. And to my mind, that is incredibly dangerous. I think with all of its problems, what you might want to call the Nehruvian and post-Nehruvian system, roughly from 1947 to 2014, the aim was, even whilst trying to build a powerful nation state and focus on infrastructure and all of these developmental projects, there was also an awareness that our cultural strength lay in our diversity, in being a kaleidoscope, in allowing for these energies to be in dialogue, these cultural energies. What we see today is an attempt to mute and destroy this. It's in a way, I find that this peril is now entering all of our minds. Just this morning, I was reading a beautiful account by an environmental journalist about the Thar Desert, literally on the border between India and Pakistan, where this is Aarti Kumar Rao. It's an amazing book called Margin Lands. She talks about how there is an ethic of water in the desert, whether it's a deep well which goes right down to the aquifer or more surface water near the top of the dune. The understanding for centuries has been that every traveler, dweller in that region has access to it, irrespective of religion. So there's a beautiful moving scene where there's a Hindu, a farmer, a shepherd, and a Muslim who happens to be going through who actually sit down and share this water. And the first thought that came to me today was, my goodness, how long is it going to be before this situation gets weaponized in our current scenario? And quite honestly, I found myself breaking down because I thought, this is something that we should cherish, this ability to share scarce resources. This is at the level of survival. And the first thought that comes to us today is, how will the forces of division and polarization weaponize this scenario? And it speaks to how deep this crisis has gone at one level. At another level, I think, so long as our various regional forces do not replicate this kind of model, we're fine. Because there's a tendency to sometimes idealize or romanticize the regional traditions. But when we look closely at them, they often also suffer from a notion of inside and outside, who belongs, who doesn't. Some of them are patriarchal. I mean, there's a tendency sometimes to elevate above the ordinary traditions of ecstatic devotionalism, for instance, bhakti. Now, take those poems out of their context, and they indeed seem to speak of redemption and transcendence. Place them in their social context, and other kinds of turbulences emerge. Patriarchy, lineage elites, notions of master and disciple. I don't think there's a simple way out. I think we need to, and here's the problem, which I think I want to talk about a little and see if everyone around this table shares this question. The enemy, if we want to characterize them like that, are able to trade in very broad, universal claims, which are based on ressentiment, they're based on reclaiming something that's lost, they're based on some imaginary notion of historical wrongs. But for our part, we are not able to strike back with that kind of broad generalization. Our entire method is based on detail. For instance, faced with the claim that Mughal architecture is alien and comes from West Asia, this is an absurd claim that is made by the right wing here. My instinct and what I've done in writing is to say, no, look at it closely. You'll find Jain elements there. You'll find elements that come from Hindu parikrama. You'll find all kinds of things. There might well be a hammam design from Khorasan, but there's also all kinds of other things. The trouble with that reading in detail is that it's very, very difficult to relay to a population that is now being trained to work from resentment.
Yeah. Well, which also, raises the question, because our choices are so constricted by this political environment that we currently inhabit. And when you think about the history of this constriction, you start asking also some very basic questions like, how did we arrive, living in very complex, very diverse, very multicultural civilizations at this sorry state? What were the pressures on the people who decided that the nation state was the ideal form for their particular communities to inhabit and feel safe in? And this is where, I want to throw open this question also to the Americans in this audience, because obviously the history of the United States or the history of Western Europe does not provide those answers. It's the history of global imperialism that provides those answers. It's that there were pressures on Ottoman Turkey, there were pressures on India starting the 18th century and Ottoman Turkey in the 19th century. And those pressures became so intolerable at some point. Those civilizations that had existed here for a very long period felt that the only way in which they could defend themselves was to find a different kind of political structure. And that political structure was suggested to them by the apparent success of Europeans, or Europeans who had actually conquered or oppressed or managed to bully many of us in Ottoman Turkey or indeed the Indian subcontinent. So we arrive at a situation where we think the only way to escape is to actually do what they have done. and to create strong nation states with very clear, cohesive communities. In some ways, you can also see the grotesque tragedy of Israel in that context. People fleeing the ravages of European nationalism and then deciding that a version of that in the Middle East would be the right model for the survivors and the victims and their descendants. And then you end up in the situation that we are in today. And that's where this, the whole question of rediscovering these histories of coexistence becomes more than just an academic question. It's like this is urgent for us to examine, and whether there's a possibility, since the international order is in such sort of right now is in such chaos. Is there any kind of political possibility of us starting to think of maybe, those older political models but looser sovereignty? I want to return to H.N. She said something about the city-state as a model that she feels close to. A city-state, obviously, under the sort of overarching influence, not control exactly, but overarching sort of presence of a larger empire state. But that's something you think, efforts to increase the autonomy of the city-state in many parts of the world, is that some kind of a plausible answer to the problem of, coexistence, or do you think city-states are an exception? There's been a lot of talk recently, particularly in the age of globalization, of the city-state as a sort of place where London is often touted as an example, where multicultural existence can still flourish. But do you think that's an idealization?
Well, I think what makes me think about city-states of ancient times is the present. As we talked about remembering being a kaleidoscopic thing, I think why I remember those city-states is because today we're going through a similar phenomena, I think. And this phenomena has become quite clear during the pandemic. The cities like New York, London, Istanbul, or cities that are run by the opposition behave differently than the nation states during the pandemic, in terms of solidarity, in terms of sense of togetherness, and in terms of self-sustenance. So what I saw during pandemic, but before the pandemic it was there, but during the pandemic it became very clear, was that cities are becoming sort of moral and political compasses for the entire nation. When Trump came to power, New York resisted. When Boris Johnson came to power, London resisted. And Istanbul goes the same way. An Indian example should be, should be elaborated by you. But cities do resist, because these cities somehow represent the cosmopolitanism, diversity. They are fragile organisms that are very prone to, breaking by these, forces with fascist inclinations. So I think cities are already becoming something else than they were. They're not only cosmopolitan cities or the, capitals of those countries, but they now have a political and moral identity, almost in opposition to the rest of their country. So this is an interesting phenomenon that I have been thinking about. Probably that's why I'm prone to remember the city-states of ancient Greece. Of course, this is not the answer. But then, as Ranjit put it in a different way, but I would say like this: the ones that we are against, those likes of Modi or Tayyip Erdogan or Trump, or Boris Johnson, whatever, they do have a future. At least they claim to have one. And they do have a past, or at least they claim to have one clear past. we are the ones who are constantly hesitate. We are the ones who are constantly doubting ourselves and so on. We don't have the self-confidence and the faith and, the conviction as much as they do. So I think what we are looking for right now is not the model that would surpass nation state and its perils, but more like an idea, more like a sense of future where it can be, and we're looking to the past to find that. So none of the answers will be correct, but then what I feel is happening in a very mild way is that the cities are becoming political subjects of the new politics.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to get Mohsin's views on this, but I'd also like to encourage online participants to use the Q&A function at the bottom of their screens to ask any questions they might have. Mohsin, I mean, actually, I'm thinking a lot of your work, Reluctant Fundamentalist onwards, is concerned with this question of the migrant in the sort of city-state, and especially in the context of a Western city-state. And yet there are, I mean, there is obviously the model like H just described of the city as a political subject, the city where certain kind of multiculturalism is possible, which isn't possible in the hinterland. And yet at the same time, your work shows that there are tensions within that model, and that there are certain identities, racial identities, political identities, political commitments that may be in tension against the dominant ethos of even the city-state, which makes coexistence more difficult, partly perhaps because, I'm just speculating here, because the city-state, the modern city-state that we're discussing here is an artifact of economic globalization. So if migrants are welcome there, it's because they provide cheap labor to the smooth functioning of the local economy. And it's in those capacities that they're employed, and their backgrounds, their experiences, their kind of views of the world are not necessarily something that is accommodated. That's maybe tolerated at the best of times. What do you, I mean, I would love to know your views on this.
So I'm very sympathetic to the view that Eche presented, which is the city as this cosmopolitan hub. And I've always felt that myself. And I've been attracted to cities my whole life. And, Lahore is a city of whatever, 12, 14 million people. It's, remarkably cosmopolitan place for all of its many flaws and problems. The problem, I think, though, is that what we are finding is there also at this moment is a crisis of the city. If the city did not face this crisis, we could confidently hold up the example of the city and say, look at New York, look at London, look at Istanbul and Delhi and Lahore, and let's all be like that. But we can't say this. And the reason is that it is very clear that these cities, in a profound sense, are no longer working. For a young person to move to New York or London or San Francisco today, but even to move to Istanbul or Delhi, is to encounter a reality of property prices such that unless you have generational wealth or some uniquely generative, form of capital, a Harvard degree or a degree from LUMS in Lahore or Oxbridge in the UK or whatever it is that you can parlay into the entry price. The simple fact is the city is no longer affordable for almost anyone. And the more cosmopolitan the city, the less affordable it seems to be. I mean, of course, there are exceptions of cities that are relatively, inexpensive and remain, but they really are the exception. Now, people still move in, of course. Lahore's population is growing. When I was born, it was 3 million. When I went to college, it was 5 or 6. Now it's 12. It'll likely be 25, in 10 years. So they're growing. And of course, it's not that the city is sort of an unmitigated disaster, although you can no longer breathe the air, and the water we used to pump out of the ground and drink from taps and with hand pumps when I was a child is now so toxic that you couldn't even dream of it. Plus the aquifer has fallen hundreds of meters, so it requires a machine bore to get the water out. But leaving aside the environmental degradation, there's something of a trap in the coexistence of our hope for cosmopolitanism in a radically unequal and increasingly difficult for young entrants location. I somehow don't have the idea of what I don't know, that the historical city-state was quite like this. Maybe it was. I don't know, to be honest. If you went to the outskirts of Granada, or Istanbul, centuries ago, whether you got broke just trying to find a place to put your tent. But I do know that today, you're seeing a complete breakdown, that cities champion a cosmopolitanism that seems unaffordable to so many people. And I think it is in that vulnerability that the confident preaching of the other side, as it's been described, is so effective. Because the other side merely has to say, look at you hypocrites, open to the world, and yet no one from the world can afford to live where you live. And it is a devastatingly effective criticism. Now, it doesn't mean that the alternative, of course, is the response. But somewhere between the relatively inexpensive life of the hinterland and the cosmopolitan, rarefied expenses of the metropole, surely is a fertile territory for us to explore. But I just can't think of anybody who's really successfully exploring it at this moment, at least not at a national level, where I can look at and sort of say, yeah, this experiment seems to be working.
This very elegantly, I think, goes into the core of a question that's just been raised. I think the question is about religion, but Mohsin, I think what you seem to be saying is that capitalism, which is at the bedrock of the new sort of city-state, as it were, and capitalism brings with it a degree of social inequality, economic inequality, which becomes intolerable to the point whereby that very fragile model or the city-state is then used by demagogues to rouse the masses in the hinterland and carry out political revolutions. We've seen this in the UK most prominently in recent years, and there are other examples of that. Obviously, the whole campaign against East Coast elites that Trump has led, that's been very, very effective, that kind of propaganda, which then again, seems to confirm that cosmopolitanism under the auspices of globalization might be quite untenable. It's proving to be untenable, might be even counterproductive, which then raises the question, we talk about religion being as this very divisive thing that sets community against each other, but actually in a way, doesn't religion, and this is one of the questions here, didn't religion actually offer a better basis for coexistence or religious values or religious traditions than capitalism today? More kind of secular modes of being in the world, but actually, shared values, shared religious values, even if people didn't belong to the same denomination. I just want to throw open this question. Ranjit, would you have something to say about this?
2 or 3 responses, really. I also am fascinated, as Eche and Mohsin are, by the possibilities, but also the downside of the city. And as they were both speaking, it drew me back to the work that I'm actually engaged on right now, which is trying to write my introduction to a translation I've done of Mir Taqi Mir, the great Urdu poet who lived at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And he lived in Agra and in Delhi, great cities, but which were shaken by constant invasions at that point from the West. So he's one of the poets, we know this, who whose work belongs substantially to this genre called the Sheher-Ashob, the elegy for the great city. But I've been fascinated by how his lament for the collapse of Delhi as it's attacked by Nadir Shah and then Ahmad Shah Durrani and others coming in from further west. Alongside this deeply moving poetry is also what I think of as his business correspondence, which has then to do with patronage, with which powerful chieftain is going to protect him, how does he manage his alignments. And it strikes me that there is a previous history to this, to what we now see as probably something very specific in the age of late capital. This relationship between people whose cultural work looks to the future, but who are in many ways aligned with the political crisis of the moment and structures of patronage. I think these questions have been with us for a very long time, but it's all in the nature of a rather lengthy aside. To respond to what you just asked, Pankaj, I think there's also been a tension always between the impulses of spirituality, which tend to be more emancipatory, which recognize the vulnerability of the other, and which want to release the self to the other. All of that on one side, and organized religion, where all of these impulses then get stylized and eventually lost under the swaddling clothes of iconography, of ritual, of ceremonial, and so on. So I think that is a question that we need to, that is very dramatic to us in India at this point, where we practically have a state religion with its state iconography. And many of us are falling back on far more syncretic, traditional, everyday forms of spiritual quest. But how do these relatively small scale, interstitial forms of spiritual quest stand up to this machine of organized state religion now? I think that's a question that we in India are going to have to confront in the decade to come.
We have another question. A couple of very interesting, insightful comments. But there's a question here about how can we imagine reclaiming the cultures of coexistence in the age of weaponization of religion in so-called modern nation states, like seen recently in the case of the use of religious toxicity under the Modi government in India. I was just thinking about the complex paradox of self-centered nation states and the impossibility of restoring cultures of coexistence in the age of far-right extremist toxic politics of religion in national context. How it can be addressed without addressing the question of singular authentic idea of the nation state. I think, I mean, it's obviously impossible to answer questions of this sort. I think the object of exercises like these is to simply highlight some neglected realities of the past and some neglected, obviously, realities of the present, and to try and see glimmers of possibility in there, and also allied with the hope that the world we live in is actually changing very rapidly, and that many things that we've taken for granted for some time now, including the nation state, are much more fragile than they seem. That their kind of assertion of strength in a way maybe is actually an attempt to conceal its fragility, its weakness, inner weakness. And the international system itself, I think, is under tremendous stress and tremendous strain. So it's in that context, I think, a reflection on these subjects or these issues helps us to actually, look out a little bit more. Otherwise, it feels like, yes, far-right politics, extremist upsurges everywhere, burgeoning, nationalist, hyper-nationalist movements, white nationalism in Europe. But I feel that increasingly we've kind of boxed ourselves into an intellectual corner by reflecting or thinking too much about these current realities and not realizing that these are contingent too. that they emerged at a particular time in history, and that they might fade faster than we can expect or imagine at this present moment. And we have to be prepared for that moment. In other words, I mean, I'm just throwing this out, and I'd love the two of you to tell me, Ece and Mohsin, what you think about this.
This intellectual corner that you talked about, and Mohsin's idea, impression of the city as being a trap and also an impossibility for the young ones and so on, and that it can be easily criticized, and probably rightfully so, somehow came together in my head. Of course, cities are the intellectual corners that we are pushed by the brutal attacks of far right and the provincialism of far right and the spread of far right. We are actually imprisoned in these cities because we cannot live anywhere else. Only cities can home us because they are colorful and so on. Outside the cities, it's the others, the parochial, the ones who worship Nordi, whatever. So it's not easy for us to live outside cities. So this means that we are not really free to do what we want, being the cosmopolitans. I think it is ironic. But then, speaking of religion, I mean, since I am the only woman in the panel, I have to say this. It is not easy for me to speak about religion as if it's a benign concept. As a woman who lost her everything almost to political Islam in Turkey, it is not easy for me to imagine as a better option than the nation state. Or, I mean, we're not even obliged to do such a comparison, but still, it's not easy to do that. Having said that, I think we, the cosmopolitans, or we, the people living in cities, we, the people who are against far right and so on, we, the people who are thinking about cohabitation, diversity, and so on, I think we have to look into the toolbox of religion to apply them in progressive politics. This is a topic that I will be talking about in Washington a lot, so I'm going to keep it very short, but we have to think about faith and how faith operates. Because as Rashid mentioned before, and I underlined it, we don't have a future, we don't have a past, and we do not believe in future and the past as much as the far right do. So in order to remedy our intellectual lethargy and our political paralysis, I think we have to we have to understand the toolbox of faith, how faith operates, and why we do not have faith, neither in democracy, nor in ourselves or the future. I think this is going to be the most important question when we trying to remember the past and trying to imagine the future.
I would say, I think in response to your remark about religion, I mean, I think I completely understand that, but I think when Ranjit speaks about organized religion, I think that is the word probably best applied to the case of political Islam. And I think when he speaks of spiritual values or values that can be invoked as a form of resistance against this, very monolithic ideology, political ideology, religious ideology emanating from the state, that's when spiritual values or the values belonging to little traditions or folk traditions become hugely important. That we can call them religious or we can call them spiritual, but the fact that they are not in any way allied to, even opposed to, very strongly opposed to the dominant homogenizing tendencies of the modern nation state, which uses political Islam, which uses political Hinduism to legitimize itself. So that's, I think, it's interesting to think about, those sort of particular distinctions, how religion, organized religion in particular, has been deployed as an ideology of the nation state, and also religious values and traditions that exist outside the ideology of the nation state can never be appropriated because they are just naturally resistant to that kind of political appropriation. Mohsen, do you have any comments on this?
Yes, I think, for me, what's very interesting, I wish we could go on much longer, but what's very interesting to me is we must also reckon with the technological reality of our present moment. The attraction of the city-state as the classical sense of 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, was perhaps at a time when human beings were more puny, where somebody couldn't genetically modify some organism in a country far away and wipe out the entire planet, or when we didn't have the capacity to change each other's weather by driving too many automobiles. It feels like now as we run up against the constraints of the planet, and as our own power as a species increases exponentially, the ability for us to retreat from one another is becoming more and more attenuated. It is hard for us to do this. It's becoming harder and harder to retreat from each other. And this is occurring against the technological backdrop of a world where we can all see each other sort of all the time, where we encounter each other in this sort of technology intermediated context of social media and WhatsApp and Facebook and etc. TikTok. Now, I think that what we're also seeing is of course, this technological reality is brought to us, from a particular sort of monopolistic, capitalistic paradigm, and it's having very profound effects, almost like religious effects to a certain extent, and it's causing humanity to encounter sort of a machine culture, which is influencing our culture. And I think, among the characteristics of machine culture appears to be a hyperfixation on sorting. Are you a 1 or a 0? And so today we are witnessing the rise of this incredible sorting impulse in almost all of us. Two childhood friends that will no longer speak because they are on different sides of the question of whether they support Imran Khan or Erdogan or Trump. The idea that we can express things 99% in common and disagree on 1%, and then discover that we must cancel each other, we must hate each other. I think there's something happening now in this particular technological cultural moment where we are being, like machines, sorted in more and more fine gradations. And we are coming to believe that those gradations are mutually exclusionary. And we are coming to prioritize one facet of our identity over another facet. And so I think as we talk about where we are and where we're going to head, reckoning with this is also very important, which is as we enter machine culture, as it is being given to us today, we are entering an environment where we are encouraged to think of each other in binary, like us, not like us terms, to do that at ever finer gradations, and with catastrophic results for our societies, for our vision of the future, and above all, for our capacity to imagine some kind of inclusive future for humanity that we could all participate in. It seems impossible to even think of such a thing. And that, I think, is something we really must reckon with, which is, what are we to do about this? Because in the absence of that, with such a powerful dynamic, at work upon all of us, the ability to imagine the future becomes compromised. As that becomes compromised, the only alternative is to fetishize the past. And so you see the victory of political ideologies that are based on the fetishization of the past. And if we're going to find a way out, we need to reckon with the predicament that we're in.
Ranjit, do you have any comments on that?
I was amazed as Mohsen was speaking to think of how this scenario that he outlined was something that seemed rather utopian about 20 years ago. I don't know if anyone remembers this book, Chris Anderson's book, The Long Tail, which of course has to do with markets. And when it first came out, and he talked about how, there will be a long tail of various communities and constituencies, each built around its own interests. And at that point, one thought this might not be an unhealthy thing, rather than imagining large mobilizations and large groups of people wanting to demand the same kind of thing. This is a situation where there's a kind of tapestry of different people doing their own things. Today, we see the downside of that. That kind of fragmentation of attention, of commitment, of interest actually means that it's very, very difficult to imagine a single public sphere where we might assert, for instance, the kinds of claims that we would like. Who do we appeal to? How do we reach out to them? And so for that reason, I've been preoccupied in recent years with this question of how do we reach out to people in exactly this kind of technological and market scenario? Market-oriented, where the market becomes a metaphor in this fragmented and fragmenting way. So I would simply flag the question of thinking about pedagogy that we might want to think about developing in some way, not in terms of just defining a curriculum, but how do we imagine a pedagogy that emphasizes vulnerability, openness, plurality, thinking about the past in multiple ways and retrieving something from it in the spirit of anamnesia. Not forgetting, but not forgetting things that redeem us, rather than just dogmatic grounds for revisiting historical wrongs and translating them into wrongs in the present.
H.A.?
Well, I mean, like, now we're talking about religion, remembering, and future, and so on. What Erdogan did in Turkey, and I think this is what Modi is doing in India, and this is like they're playing by the same playbook, so it's not much different, although the countries are completely different than each other. They are rewriting a history, and the narrative is so easy, catchy, and so on. And yeah, they reach out to people, and this narrative is almost swallowed without thinking, and then reproduced again and again. And this narrative does not only define what religion is, but also what a human being is, and what a human being should be, and so on, and what what lies beyond or outside this definition is, that person, that community do not even have the right to exist at all. So yeah, how do we reach out in this case? That's why I'm thinking about, you call it spirituality, Pankaj, but I call it faith, or toolbox of the faith. I think if we could believe in what we say, what we think, if we could be sure, if there was no doubt, I think reaching out to people would be easier, because believing, I think, is the strongest, strongest ability of human being. And once you start believing, and once you start connecting to others who believe, I think this is what politics, or my kind of politics, need today. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit, because I was really thinking about what you said, Ranjit, and Mohsen, what Mohsen said, and I'm trying to, bring them all together in my head. Yeah, I'm living here. It's just I think
it's a sort of subjective power of belief, of faith, that is definitely under a kind of unprecedented pressure from the sort of technological atomization that Mohsen spoke of, which is a kind of objective process right now, irreversible, perhaps unstoppable. which is actually, you know, making the prospect of political change, social change even more complicated and fraught. So I think, you know, the point about faith is hugely important, and a sort of a community of believers. You know, I suppose that's what in the past political commitments, political organizations used to be organized around that particular principle, and that is still hugely important. But again, I think the challenges of this sort of enforced individuation that Mohsen is describing, those are really, I mean, incredible challenges and unprecedented challenges, and it's definitely something to be kind of reckoned with as we think about the future. Obviously, something that is not faced by the societies that we've been discussing, Al-Andalus or Ottoman Turkey or Mughal India. This is something, you know, truly new, and a really formidable challenge for all of us. But there's more to come, and there's more reflections and conversations to come in April on precisely these subjects, and I would encourage you all to join us then. There are 2 more webinars, and there's another one coming up on March 7th, where we'll be talking with Nesreen Malik and Zhang Lijia about the global histories of feminism, a movement, an idea that is associated too narrowly with Western countries. And I think in this particular section on March 7, we'll be looking more at the sort of non-Western traditions of feminism. So we have guests from Sudan and another one from China who would be exploring these questions. And I would invite you all to join us. And I should really thank HA, Mohsen, Ranjit for a really incredibly stimulating. I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour or so, because this is really, it's a very fruitful subject, and you know, you all are absolutely stimulating in your responses to it. But thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you all very soon.